Special report.
Good afternoon to you, and thank you for joining us on this very sad day in American history, a day unlike our soil has ever seen.
That's right. Attacks in Washington, New York, and a large plane crash in Pennsylvania all appear to be connected. The lives lost, only God knows. Here was the scene earlier this morning, New York. A plane hits one tower of the World Trade Center. About 20 minutes later,
a second plane, which you can see headed toward the second tower, crashes in a ball of flames. Now, the plane is an American Airlines Flight 11 from Boston headed to Los Angeles, which was hijacked. We've learned this is a Boeing 767. Both towers burned for more than an hour, then the unthinkable.
The towers, 110 stories high, symbols of the American spirit, collapse, along with the hearts of millions of Americans and others around the world. As we said, we don't know how many people are dead, and it's not right to guess right now. We can say it is fair to categorize the losses as catastrophic. The New York skyline reduced to a cloud of dust. There's been at least one other explosion. Unfortunately, that is not where this horrible story ends.
Some 226 miles to the south, an aircraft hit the Pentagon, the heartbeat of the U.S. military. Exactly what type of aircraft is still unknown. Now, American Airlines has confirmed it lost a second plane, Flight 77, from Dulles to Los Angeles. There is also a United flight that's unaccounted for. That flight number 175 from Dulles to Los Angeles. Now, we don't know which plane crashed into the Trade Center or there at the scene at the Pentagon that you're looking at. There are reports that it too was a Boeing 767, unconfirmed at this time. It all happened at about 9:45 at the west side of the Pentagon in Northern Virginia, which is the heliport side of the building, the part of the Pentagon that has since collapsed. Once again, all we know is that there have been hundreds of injuries. We don't know how many people have died in the buildings or the airplane.
Well, less than an hour later, another plane. A United Airlines flight crashed in Pennsylvania. This happened about 80 miles from Pittsburgh. It's Flight 93. It was headed from Newark in New Jersey to San Francisco on the West Coast. Again, details are coming in pieces and will continue to do so throughout the day and perhaps throughout the weeks to come.
Again, recapping what has happened. Today, Tuesday, September 11th, a series of attacks that began here in New York City. That's where two airplanes, at least one hijacked passenger plane, slammed into the World Trade Center towers. Both towers have since collapsed. They've gone, vanished from the New York skyline. Since then, another attack at the Pentagon and another passenger jet crashed in Pennsylvania. Now, of course, these attacks certainly have all of us, the nation, on edge. Federal buildings have been shut down and other large towers have been evacuated.
The big question, of course, is who did this? Why? How could this happen? Right now, we don't know the answers to those questions, but there are reports that Islamic Jihad might be responsible. America's military bases here and around the world are on full alert, as you might imagine. Melissa Busher is live at Fort Bragg with the details. Melissa?
Bill, Renee, things are developing very fast here at Fort Bragg. I want to bring in right away Colonel Roger King to give us the very latest on where Fort Bragg stands at this time. I understand that we are under a heightened security alert.
Well, that's true. In response to the terrorist attacks this morning in New York City and Washington, D.C., Fort Bragg's assessing the situation. We think that we're responding appropriately. We are increasing security measures on the post, and of course, all these activities are being taken with regard to increasing the safety and security of the people who live and work on the installation.
You are working toward a THREATCOM Delta, which is the highest state of alert that a military installation can have. What will that mean for people trying to get in and off post?
Well, there are a lot of different actions that go into making the highest level of force protection that we have. The most visible one will be things like this access point that's just to our rear. All the vehicles that are entering the post will be checked. It'll be determined whether or not people have business on the installation. If they don't, they'll be told that they shouldn't be on Fort Bragg today. But those people who do have business on Fort Bragg will be allowed access. It's just going to take time. There will be delays, and people can expect that.
And what happens from here as far as a leadership standpoint at Fort Bragg?
Well, there's a constant assessment that goes on whenever you have a situation like this to determine the level of threat that Fort Bragg itself may have and the response that we made to that. We have random measures that we take. We have periodic measures that we take, and we may go back and forth on those just as a way of keeping things from developing a pattern, because one of the most effective ways that you can have to combat terrorism is to not have patterns to the way you do business.
And finally, Colonel King, have any soldiers been put on alert to be ready to deploy? I know you are always ready to deploy, but do you have soldiers at this time packing, getting ready to go?
No more than the soldiers that we always have ready to go. No units on the installation have been notified for deployment.
Colonel Roger King, thank you very much for bringing us the very latest information from Fort Bragg. We should also mention that Pope Air Force Base is already at a THREATCOM Delta. That is the highest state of alert. Special Forces officials have also said to us here they have also increased their security. Would not get into a lot of details, but Renee and Bill, again, I want to show you what you're dealing with. Right now, there are military police officers stopping every car. A lot of them are having to make U-turns, so it is very difficult to get on post. It is backing up traffic on Bragg Boulevard because most of the entrances in this area are from Bragg Boulevard. So the best advice at all is if you don't have business at Fort Bragg to stay away and also try to avoid Bragg Boulevard if you can. Back to you.
It's going to be a horrendous traffic jam all day.
And speaking of traffic, we have to mention air traffic. Across the nation, airports, no flights are allowed to take off or land. So if you're expecting a flight or planning to travel on a flight, of course, that will be the situation there.
Tom Lawrence is out at Raleigh-Durham International, which of course has been shut down with all of the other airports. Tom, how are things out there? I guess just it's like nothing going on, huh?
Bill, as you might imagine, yes, things are very, very quickly winding down here, and things did happen very quickly. Shortly after we got here, we noticed that there were still flights in the air, certainly, but all flights canceled, all outbound flights canceled, and a number of aircraft diverted to this area. The people here, the travelers that we spoke with, basically in shock, wondering what happened. They didn't know. Hundreds of thousands of people were in the air when this whole thing began to unfold this morning about 8:45. And many were taken off planes right as they sat at the gate. Things became very, very hectic at RDU. Terminals emptied and outbound flights were canceled, as I mentioned. Planes were jammed, phones were jammed too, as travelers tried to find out what had happened. Many did not know. The airport, of course, shut down televisions as a matter of course when there's a plane crash, and many are stranded here now, as about 25 flights were diverted to RDU. Here's what some of those folks had to say about what happened.
I was supposed to leave at 9:45. We were on the plane, and they took us all.
Were you guys headed out or
Orlando.
What? Orlando?
Mm-hmm.
What, were you on the plane or?
We got on the plane and then they asked us to come off and then they canceled the flight.
I was shocked, and I just can't even imagine the potential devastation in New York City.
They shut off all the TVs here, so just what people are finding over the phone. A lot of people are really scared about flying to begin with, and a lot of people have just been saying that they don't want to go back up at all.
Now, the airport authority is meeting with airline managers about now, I understand. They will be deciding what is going to happen later. We don't know when later. We have no idea when flights will resume. Some flights inbound to RDU this morning were likely diverted to other airports. They were told to put down, to land at the nearest airport they could get into. So we probably have some folks inbound to RDU who are stuck. The RDU Airport Authority suggests you go to their website, rdu.com, for information, updated information. That website will likely be very jammed, as are the phone lines to airlines. It's going to be a real tough situation for some time. The decision to begin flying again will likely come from the FAA. Of course, it's probably going to come from much higher up than the FAA, and we have no idea when we'll have word of that. Bill, Renee.
All right, Tom Lawrence on the unprecedented action by the FAA to shut down all domestic flights following the terrorist attack in New York.
A lot of folks are walking around in a stage of shock, I think, at this point. As Tom has said, some are even making comparisons, thinking of Pearl Harbor. But this is something we really cannot compare it to.
That's right. Lieutenant General Robert Springer, retired from the Air Force, WRAL's military consultant. Put it into perspective for us. Certainly one of the darkest days that I can remember.
Well, as some have been saying this morning, this is war. Somebody has declared war on the United States. It may be a handful of terrorists, but it's clearly a very well organized terrorist group. One would have to wonder how so many flights could have somebody board that plane with a weapon that they could use to take over the cockpit. Not only take over the cockpit, but fly the airplane. I cannot envision any pilot on a commercial airline or a military airplane that would intentionally, because of guns to the back of his or her head, fly an airplane into a building like that. They'd do something else because they're going to be dead anyway.
Well, back in the 70s, we used to have a lot of hijackings, but there was increased security. When was the last domestic hijacking? I bet,
I can't
it's
recall.
Been a long time.
I can't recall the most recent one, but we should know when an airplane is under duress or being hijacked. Right. There are ways to alert the authorities to that.
Other question that comes to mind, some are speculating that these planes may have even had explosives on board. As we watch what happened to the World Trade Center, to get that kind of explosive on board a plane,
unfortunately, not all of the luggage is x-rayed or sniffed by a dog as it goes on the airplane. And as long as the passenger that's tied to that airplane gets on the airplane, it's okay. Obviously, if there was some doubt about luggage being on the airplane but the passenger not being on, then they would delay it and check all the luggage. That's the procedure anyway.
What do we do now? I mean, there's obviously a sense of we want to find out who did it, and we want to make sure that they pay for this.
One of the other things that is interesting about finding out who did it, as recently as yesterday, there were comments that there were no known terrorist threats to America, homeland. Now, how did all of this happen and take place without us intercepting phone calls, email traffic, whatever it might be?
We were caught flat-footed.
We were caught flat-footed. But it also tells you when we complain about going through the magnetometers at the airport, or when we complain about putting fences up at Fort Bragg, these are the kinds of things you have to be prepared for.
One FBI official this morning said this is the equivalent of a nuclear attack against the United States. He likened it to that.
Yeah, and a small tactical nuclear weapon in New York City for sure. But then to go against the Pentagon, airports, Camp David, there is a lot we'll have to learn, and this will take years till we get to the bottom of all this.
Let's talk about the Pentagon for just a moment. I mean, that corner of the Pentagon.
Never been attacked before, ever.
Heliport area, so you would think that the security at that corner would be even heightened than what you would find on the other four sides.
What you have protecting the Pentagon is the federal police, which is a civilian organization manned by civilian, highly competent professional police. That side is not only the side for the helipad, but it would also be the side for helicopter evacuations of wounded members in such an attack. So it makes it an even more critical point, but easily discernible as why they would want to attack that location.
Someone speculated this morning, I know there will be speculation, that perhaps this is the work of Osama bin Laden, that he's the only person who might have the apparatus, the money, and the desire to pull off something like this.
Well, it certainly, in my book, would be the #1 candidate for the action right now. But it's like any incident or accident, no matter how great the magnitude may be. It's like anything that we do. Initially, the information we get is muddy or wrong and has to be corrected as we go on. And we do that all the time here in the media world.
Covering history when it's red hot.
That's right. And then you have a chance to go back and reflect and get the facts. But until we see a lot more, but I would agree with you, I don't think a nation would do this because of the tremendous consequences. It also said to me this morning, there's been a lot of criticism of President Bush for wanting to establish a national missile defense against rogue nations, not against China, not against Russia, but against people who want to take down the big boy on the block. And the big boy on the block, the only superpower we have is the United States of America. Look what they went for, the symbols of American power, finance in the World Trade Center, military in the Pentagon, presidents, see itself. It's amazing.
Let's talk about the president. We saw a statement from him early this morning, a little after 9, from Sarasota, Florida. It was reported at that time he would be boarding Air Force One and headed for Washington, D.C.
Yes.
Not heard anything else. How likely is it that the president would actually head for Washington, D.C. at this time?
I think, I can understand how that would happen. One of the main reasons, although we could go anywhere with that 747, there are other 747s there. They're known as NECAP. It's a National Emergency Airborne Command Post, where they take their senior staff and they run the government and direct the activities from that. I understand we've evacuated much of the constitutional leadership from Washington. We used to have a resort, Greenbrier Resort, up in West Virginia.
Don't have it anymore, do we?
And we mothballed that because the Cold War was over.
Yeah.
Cold War isn't over. It's just a different war. It's a terrorist war, it's a cyber war, whatever it may be, but we should never let down our guard.
What would you advise the president to do, General Springer, now? And
Well,
this great sense of loss and this incredible dark cloud that hangs over America right
number
now.
one is he has to sympathize with all the families. Yes. I think that's critical because these people were doing their daily chores and taking care of their families or whatever it may have been, but there'd be a tremendous loss of life and grief across this nation. And I think he needs to reflect on that. I think he also needs to see that every aspect of the government, from the FBI to the CIA to the Department of Defense, the National Security Agency, all of those people are concentrating on this, but not at the expense of not watching what other terrorist threats may be on the horizon.
It's just been so long since we have felt the sting of terrorism in this country.
And
nothing
ever to this degree.
extent.
Nothing to this degree.
We feel too secure, and yet we hear all the threats and all the stories, but it'll never happen to us.
General Springer, we've got video now of the president's first reaction to the airplane crash at the World Trade Center, and he was in Sarasota, Florida, when he made this announcement.
Down in front. Down in front.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I unfortunately will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary of Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
That was after 9 o'clock this morning, after he first learned of the first part of the terrorist attacks, the wave of attacks.
Exactly. And at this point, there is no absolute word on numbers of lives lost. I heard speculation that it could easily be in the thousands. Thousands, of course. That number is not confirmed and will continue to keep tallies going.
I think Mayor Giuliani up in New York said a tremendous catastrophic loss of life. Well, you know, you talked about thousands of people working in the World Trade Center. Both Twin Towers collapsed. Brian Bowman is on the telephone from the Goldsboro area, from Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, to bring us up to date there. And Brian, General Springer is with us, and he will be the other voice that you're listening to. Tell us what is going on there.
Well, gentlemen, I can tell you there's not a whole lot going on just outside the base here right now, and that's significant because typically if I were reporting to you any other day at this time, you'd probably hear F-15Es flying overhead, sort of that boom as them as they go over, and you're just not hearing that right now. There's no activity over the base right now that can be seen from right outside here at the Welcome Center. I can tell you that the base has upgraded to ThreatCon Charlie. That is not the highest. Delta is the highest, but we're just below that at ThreatCon Charlie. They are asking for a 100% ID check from anyone going onto the base, and as you can imagine, Berkeley Boulevard here, the main gate here where folks can go in, folks are having to turn around and traffic is backed up pretty well, so you want to avoid that area. Goldsboro Police are in on this also. They're up on Berkeley Boulevard routing trucks to a different direction. They're sending furniture trucks, painting trucks, that sort of thing all together to a different part of the base, and I imagine they'll be turned away when they get there too. They tell us that ThreatCon Charlie means you have to have ID to get in. There are going to be all sorts of folks who need these trucks to come in for certain jobs with the housing and that sort of thing today. They're not going to be allowed on base. One important thing about Seymour Johnson, it is an air expeditionary wing. That's a long way to say that what it is Seymour Johnson couples up with another base in another state, and they're each on a 120-day rotation. One of them will be on the bubble, as they say, for 120 days, where they would sort of be the first responders for an emergency, and while that one base is on, the other is off, and they rotate back and forth. Seymour Johnson is off the bubble right now. That means they would not be the first to respond. They go back on the bubble December 1st. However, they told us when all this began that if there is some sort of national emergency or war, all bets are off. They could be called in. Bill and General Springer?
Well, Brian, have you gotten any official statement as to what people should do in and around that base from the folks there at Seymour Johnson?
Well, the simplest thing to do is if you don't have to be here today and you don't have ID, just to stay away, because they're not going to let folks in without ID. The folks who live on base and the folks who are meant to be here should be able to get in. It's just going to take a little longer than normal. I'm looking at traffic out here at the gate right now, and it goes as far as I can see. Several hundred yards up toward the bowling alley and that sort of place, if folks know this part of town. They're just trying to keep everybody out of here who isn't supposed to be here. Again, if you have your DOD sticker on the car and your ID, you should be able to get in no problem. But if you're not a person who typically is here every day, you may have some trouble getting in.
Brian, this is General Springer. Regarding your ThreatCon, or Force Protection Level 3, or Charlie, I should say, the reason it's not at Delta, the highest level, is primarily because that means there is no specific known threat against Seymour Johnson Air Force Base.
That is correct, and in fact, I should also let you know there's nothing going on here that looks dangerous, anything like that. But again, in a case like this, that silence tells something also, because typically these jets are up in the air quite a good part of the day.
Do you think, General Springer and Brian, that if there is a retaliatory action that is ordered once the culprit, the villain, is identified, that Seymour Johnson would play a role in that?
Well, certainly if there was a role to deploy. The airplanes that they have at Seymour, though, are primarily ground attack airplanes, fighters, the Strike Eagles. So I don't see that as a major thing. What I would see more are things like air defense capable air-to-air airplanes. Now, the F-15 Eagle is an air-to-air airplane also, but it's primarily ground strike. It could occur, but you could also deploy forces from Seymour Johnson, such as your security forces that might be needed at another place, or there might be medical people. It's a very small clinic there compared to a Walter Reed, or for example, but there might be people that would be moved to a certain location to help with casualties and so on.
And again, Bill, these folks are also used to being on that 120-day bubble, so they're used to being called out if it came down to it. And one other thing that they're pretty proud of here at the base is the F-15E. Also, I understand, and General Springer can probably comment on this, it does pretty well at night. They're pretty proud of that, and if it came down to something in darkness, they may be a part of that also.
There's no doubt but what the F-15E Strike Eagle gives you a night advantage that other fighters don't have.
All right.
I've got one more question for Brian and General Springer. With all commercial air flight suspended, yes, how does that affect the military?
I made a phone call on that, and all indications are, with a few exceptions, all the military aircraft are grounded also. I did hear, I haven't been able to confirm this, but that there were some Air Force fighters that were flying cap, if you will, patrol over the White House in the Washington, D.C. Capitol area.
And that's what kind of fighters would those be?
Probably be F-16s, and they might have even been from Andrews, from the Air National Guard. Okay. From Andrews Air Force Base at Washington, D.C.
General Springer?
I was going to just conclude with Brian as well. Brian, is that pretty much what you're hearing as well?
Yeah, same thing.
Great.
All right. Brian and General Springer, thank you very much on this really a sad, sad day that just puts knots in your stomach and makes you want to go to a place to be with friends, to pray for the victims, to pray for the country. And it's a time of that in downtown Raleigh today.
And I think so many people will be connected with this in some way or another. It's certainly too early to tell for a lot of people, but I think the prayers are already being sent up. We've got our Mark Roberts, who's downtown Raleigh at Sacred Heart Cathedral, where a number of people have gathered for prayer. Pick it up there, Mark.
Renee, that's exactly right, and we apologize. We're just trying to keep our voices down here so we don't disrupt the service in any way. This is a special Mass at Sacred Heart. Pastor Jerry told us we could come here. He wanted to show folks that this service is going on, to show that the church is a place to come in times like this, to get together, as you folks mentioned. It's a special Mass for times of civil disturbance and times of war. I can quote for you what some of the things that Pastor Jerry has been saying to the crowd here, which is much larger than is normally here for the noon service that happens every day in downtown Raleigh here. He said ours is not to ask why all of these incidents happen, but to lift our voices together and ask for God's help. Very much preaching to people's religious side here, and again asking people for calm, come together, ask for forgiveness, things such as that. Nothing as far as retribution and other things such as that, and a lot of folks have really been coming in here today. Now another thing, there's a cathedral school that's right next door to the school here, and we can show you some videotape of that we shot earlier. We are 1 block away from the state capitol here in downtown Raleigh, and some parents today, there was no call to come and get your children, but a lot of parents came to the school today, picked up their young ones and took them home for a couple of reasons.
Other children in the school, so her father and I will probably try and figure out a way to make her understand so she's not afraid, because it's scary, and we certainly don't want her to be scared.
And again, those couple of reasons that some of the parents cited to us that were taking their children away were only about a block away from the Capitol. They were worried about that building being targeted and also wanting to be together with their families in a time of need. But Bill and Renee, this is a packed house here at the Sacred Heart Cathedral. Father Jerry's still up at the front. A lot of folks coming together and trying to find some answers in a very difficult time.
So it was a regular service, but certainly more people came today because of this terrible national tragedy.
That's right, Bill, and Father Jerry put out the word on the radio. That's the whole thing. That's one of the reasons why he invited us in here. He wants people to know that a church is a place to come to, whatever your denomination, in a time of need, Bill.
There is a sacred and spiritual refuge for those who are hurting so badly from this terrible, terrible series of deeds.
And Bill, I'm sorry, Renee, one other thing I could add for you. A lot of the folks that are coming in here have individual stories of how this impacts them, their relatives, people that they had up in various areas. So I think you're going to be seeing a lot of that in a lot of places across the area today.
Mark, thank you very much for that report from Sacred Heart Cathedral in downtown Raleigh, where people have come together to pray for the victims and to pray for the country.
And a lot of people are trying to reach relatives that are in the New York, Washington areas. Be aware, phone lines are going to be jammed. We've gotten information from the major phone carriers that you're going to have a difficult time getting through on phone lines. So at this point, just kind of suspend the effort to try and reach them. We also have some information we can pass along from the airlines that include some phone numbers that you'll be able to call. So if you get pencil and paper ready, we'll try and pass that information on to you.
And the internet is awfully slow today. Of course, that's carried by the telephone, and that would explain that. So it's going to be a day of slow communication, and patience will have to be the order of the day. Our Fred Taylor.
Yes, I was just going to add, a couple of things have been shut down as a result. Financial markets have suspended trading in wake of the attack. Securities and Exchange Commissions and all financial markets, as we said, are closed for the day.
That's right. Fred Taylor is our veteran legislative correspondent. He is in downtown Raleigh talking about security down there. Fred, what is the latest from downtown Raleigh?
Well, Bill, what we have here is that we understand the federal building has been closed down. Of course, that is on federal orders. Governor Easley, who is in charge of the state, has issued a partial alert, putting the state emergency response team on standby. Fortunately, we've had no targets here. We've had no incidents, but the CERT, the state emergency response team, is on alert. We'll be briefed later today about what is going on. The Capitol is closed to the public. The state legislature, where they lowered the flags, the American flag and the state flag, to half-staff early this morning, the building is still open. They are planning to have business as usual today, although there are extra security guards. The Highway Patrol sent about a dozen troopers down here this morning to beef up security. As you recall, the legislative building was evacuated by a bomb threat a couple of weeks ago. So nothing has happened. That's the good news, but they are on alert down here. They have beefed up security and will be briefed as the day progresses. Bill and Renee.
All right, Fred, let's do a little recapping here again. Here's a timeline of the events that we have this morning. Plane crashes into the tower of World Trade Center in Lower Manhattan. That was just before 9 o'clock this morning. Many of you were watching television in disbelief, witnessed another plane coming in about 18 minutes later. Right there, you see the video there. President Bush was in Florida talking to some school children. He called it an apparent terrorist attack. Then an aircraft crashed near the Pentagon, just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. That was about an hour after the attacks in New York. Government buildings in Washington, including the Capitol and the White House, were evacuated with officials citing a credible threat of a terrorist attack. The Federal Aviation Administration shut down all aircraft takeoffs after that. Shortly after 10 o'clock this morning, one World Trade Center tower in New York collapsed. It was just an incredible sight, and about an hour, that was about an hour after the plane first hit it. American Airlines then identified one of its planes that crashed into the trade tower as Flight 11 out of Boston en route to L.A. Then you had senior law enforcement officials saying a car bomb exploded outside the State Department in Washington. Federal Protective Services later denied a car bomb attack occurred. The financial markets, as Renee mentioned just a minute ago, suspended trading in wake of the attacks. Then, out near Pittsburgh in western Pennsylvania at the Somerset County Airport, there was a report of a large plane crashing out there, United Airlines plane. A fourth explosion rocked the collapsed remains of the World Trade Center. That was at 10:38 this morning. You're seeing some of the debris on the ground there in New York outside the World Trade Center towers. Authorities across the country have gone on alert, tightening security at strategic facilities and evacuating high security buildings. And as Melissa Busher told us about the heightened sense of alert down at Fort Bragg, and also the second highest stage of alert at Seymour Johnson. What did you call that, General Springer? The
force protection level,
right. Charlie. Okay. So that's pretty much a timeline of the events. In terms of casualties, we really don't know, but many are speculating that could very well be in the thousands.
Let me help put that perspective on the numbers of people in those towers. Each floor in each tower has its own zip code.
Wow. Each floor?
Each floor.
My goodness. That's how large it is.
Some were concerned that the business day, just very, very shortly before 9 o'clock, and there was speculation that things may not have been as busy as it could have been. But we're still talking about an awful lot of people that could have occupied those offices even by that early hour.
I think the estimates I've read and heard are 50,000 in the building. And then those are good-sized cities.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, you have two planes.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the collapse of the building. So you may have had emergency workers who were then on the ground trying to help those, and who knows how many were trapped inside.
Well, you know, there is a tremendous need now for blood.
Yes.
Tremendous need now in New York. You can just imagine what the scene is like at the hospitals up there. Sherry Mitchell with the American Red Cross is here to talk about that need and how you have already responded.
Yes, we've already, from the Carolinas region, 600 units in, and we're particularly in need of O-type blood because that is the universal blood type, and we can transfuse that in anyone in a trauma situation. So we are appealing for people to give blood, but we need you to come in staggered amounts. We can't handle everybody today, so if you'll call 1-800-GIVE-LIFE or your local Red Cross chapter, then you can find out when it's most convenient to give blood and schedule an appointment to come in.
Now,
again, 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
L-I-F-E.
Okay.
Now, for Sherry, those who may be interested in making that phone call, what's involved in the process of giving blood?
Basically, you only have to be between the at least 17 years of age and 110 pounds and healthy, and you go through a medical screening and we'll determine if you are healthy enough to give blood, and it only takes 8 to 10 minutes to actually give that gift of life.
What have you heard from New York? I know there's been the call. How bad is it
Our disaster team is responding. We do have specially trained disaster volunteers and staff that are trained in weapons of mass destruction in response to those situations, as well as aviation disasters. So all Red Cross resources have been deployed, and we will be assisting the victims, the family, and the emergency personnel throughout this terrible situation.
Is this like anything you've ever?
No.
I mean, it doesn't compare to anything that I can remember.
Absolutely not. We were very involved in the Oklahoma bombing, and that's as close as it comes, but this seems to just
And I'm sure in all of your training, you all go through mock disaster situations.
Yes,
you
we
couldn't have
do.
even trained for something to this magnitude.
That's correct. And we even have the expertise of mental health disaster volunteers, certified mental health workers, and they help our workers get through the process, as well as the victims and their families. So we have been planning and preparing for this day, unfortunately.
I mean, just in the newsroom this morning, talking about the people and the looks on people's faces, it was just crushed, just.
Absolutely. You should see the volunteers and staff at the Red Cross. We're just still all in shock, even though we've been planning and preparing for this day.
Sherry, we've got some pictures of Pennsylvania. We haven't had video yet, but we've got some pictures from Somerset County, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh, where a United Airlines plane crashed this morning. And there you see the first pictures that we have. This happened about 10 o'clock this morning. That's about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Officials at the Somerset County Airport said a large plane crashed in western Pennsylvania. One of four to crash today.
And we've just gotten some information that the First Union building, as well as a number of high-rise buildings around the country, but we're talking specifically the First Union building in Charlotte, has been evacuated. We've just gotten word. And there is apparently a school near that First Union building, again in Charlotte, that has been evacuated as well. But we understand the Sears Tower, a number of other high-rise buildings across the country, high-profile buildings across the U.S. have been evacuated as a precautionary measure at this time.
Okay.
And again, Sherry, one more plea. What types of blood are you looking for, and what's the best way that people can get?
All types are needed, but we're in particularly calling for O positive and O negative. You can find out when you can make an appointment by calling 1-800-GIVE-LIFE.
Now, if you don't give blood, or if you do give blood, can you give money as well? Would that be
Yes,
helpful?
the American Red Cross will be spending a lot of our resources on the relief efforts, and it'll be a long-term effort. So if you cannot give blood, we would encourage you to give a financial contribution to help us in the other efforts.
I'm sure they can call that same number for that effort.
Yes,
as
you
well.
can.
1-800-GIVE, G-I-V-E, LIFE, L-I-F-E.
Correct. Thank you.
Sherry, thank you so much, and we'll stay in touch with you and see how things are going and what else we might be able to do to lend a hand as well.
All right, let's recap the events today. If you're just joining us, I know most of you have heard about this terrible tragedy that has struck the United States, but there were plane crashes this morning at the World Trade Center up in New York. That's in Lower Manhattan. First attack came about a little before 9 o'clock. 18 minutes later, a second plane, as you can see there, crashed into the second tower of the World Trade Center. And Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says casualties could well be in the thousands. There was also an aircraft that crashed near the Pentagon just outside of Washington, D.C. in Northern Virginia. And as we saw just a few minutes ago, we had video of that plane crash of a United Airlines flight in western Pennsylvania, about 80 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The video you see there is from the Pentagon, which had never seen any sort of attack ever. This was the first time. FBI officials were speculating that perhaps it was Osama bin Laden, that only he would have the apparatus, the money, and the desire to pull off something so tragic. And of course, national security officials were trying to figure out what happened, how it could happen, and why the United States was caught flat-footed.
Planes involved in that, 2 of them were American Airlines planes, 2 of them from United Airlines, hijacked. It is believed and has been reported that some passengers were on board some of those planes. So we're talking about not only the people that were involved in those buildings, but passengers who were on board flights that were also involved. We have also gotten word from Congressman Bob Etheridge's office, who says, as far as he's concerned, someone will pay for today's terrorist attacks in New York and Washington. He called the attack despicable. Repeating that, Congressman Bob Etheridge calls the attack despicable. Etheridge says not only should America not let the attacks go unanswered, but that, in his words, reasonable thinking people around the world have to come together and shut down terrorist acts at their root. That's from Congressman Bob Etheridge. And we do understand that Congress has been sent to a safe place and out of buildings, out of the D.C. area as well.
Okay, Renee, you were talking about the American airline flights that were involved. We do know that 159 people were on those 2 flights. And American Airlines has set up an emergency response number for those who would like to get information on this. Relatives should call, and limit it to relatives, of course, or dear friend, to this number, 1-800-245-0999. America says one of the planes involved was Flight 11. That was a Boeing 767. It was going from Boston to L.A. The flight had, 81 passengers, 9 flight attendants, and 2 pilots on board. Also involved was American Flight 77. That's a Boeing 757 operating from Washington Dulles to Los Angeles. They had 58 passengers on board, 4 flight attendants, and 2 pilots. So that makes about close to 160 people involved in these 2 planes. A statement from American makes no direct mention of today's attacks in New York City near Washington, but they have set up that number to give you their very latest information.
Exactly, and just kind of a word of recap, the World Trade Center is no more. The Southern Tower collapsed with a roar about an hour after the Twin Tower plane crashes into the New York landmark. The Northern Tower then went down in flames, billowing in smoke. One witness said earlier that he saw bodies falling from that 110-story tower and people jumping out. We understand that Governor Mike Easley here in North Carolina and Secretary of the North Carolina Department of Crime Control and Public Safety, Brian Beatty, are scheduled to have a news conference at 2 o'clock this afternoon. And you, of course, on the news channel can expect to see that live. We plan to, of course, carry that news conference live to let you know the latest developments in our state and what is going on in this area. Military installations are on different levels of alert right now, many of them in this area. We've gotten information that different installations are not allowing people on without proper credentials and identification. So be aware that if you're used to traveling onto base, onto post, you will not be able to do that installations across the state today.
Certainly it is a story that has made us all heartsick, and many people will need some counseling out of this, children, adults, all of us. We have set up a team of counselors here at WRAL, and we will be giving you information about how you can contact these counselors as we try to work through this grief, this tragedy, the mix, the myriad of emotions that come with something so horrific. Our continuing coverage will continue throughout the day on, of course, this terrorist attack. We, however, would like to leave you with a moment of meditation at the Sacred Heart Cathedral as Mass is being celebrated in downtown Raleigh. People asking for forgiveness of their sins and asking for the love of God to come into their lives and into the lives of the victims who have suffered so tragically this dark day in American history.
And we all lift our spirits and lift our hearts in prayer for those and those lives that have been lost. And a number of people will be taking a moment of silence, as the President has said earlier today from Sarasota, Florida, to ask for prayer and special guidance in this difficult time in American history. We take you now back to CBS coverage that we will continue live. We will again keep you updated on the very latest developments here in North Carolina. We will bring you a live news conference this afternoon involving Governor Mike Easley here in North Carolina and Crime Commissioner of Public Safety Brian Beatty.
If you will. But I know a number of airline pilots have been through a number of their training programs, and I can't envision an airline pilot deliberately taking his plane into a populated area or into a large high-rise like the World Trade Center. He would, I think, in almost every circumstance, force the hijacker, if that's what it was, to take control in some kind of commandeer mode. So we're still getting preliminary information from the FAA. But certainly, as far as the people on board the airplanes, the death count is not as terrible as it might have been at first blush. We're still checking, Dan.
Bob Orr in Washington. You're looking at videotape of earlier this morning. You saw A terrible scene, never to be forgotten, a haunting scene of bodies coming down the side of the World Trade Center building, one of them before both buildings collapsed, in one of the most audacious attacks ever against the United States. Terrorists hijacked at least 2 airliners and crashed them into the World Trade Center in what appears to be a coordinated series of blows, the blows that brought down both of the World Trade Center 110-story towers. A plane also slammed into the U.S. Defense Department, the Pentagon, hit a helicopter pad, then we're told, and then set fire to portions of the building. It brought the seat of the U.S. government itself under attack. There's never been anything like this in the history of the United States. This is something unique. Thousands of people are believed to be dead or injured. That's according to a high-ranking New York City police official who did not want to be quoted by name. New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani said, "I have a sense it's a horrendous number of lives lost." That's a quote. And another quote, "Right now we have to focus on saving as many lives as possible." The incredible amount of debris, steel, concrete, plaster, and what have you, now envelops what were the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center. In that debris, there may very well be some people alive at this moment. Efforts are being made to determine that. Authorities have been trying to evacuate those who work in this whole area of the Twin Towers. Many people are thought to have been trapped. About 50,000 people work at the Trade Center. American Airlines has said that its 2 aircraft known to have been hijacked were carrying a total of 156 people. Fate of those people unknown, but one has to believe that many, if not all of them, are dead. Chris Yates of Jane's Transport of London said this is perhaps the most audacious terrorist attack that's ever taken place in the world. Another quote from him, "It takes a logistics operation from the terrorist groups involved that is second to none," unquote. Now, Mr. Yates speaks of terrorist groups. There are those in diplomatic and intelligence circles who would believe that this kind of attack perhaps could not be coordinated and carried out on this scale without the help of some state governments, actual state governments. But that is, of course, speculation on their part. Nobody knows who brought this terror, this death and destruction, this horror to the United States. President Bush has ordered a full-scale investigation. By the way, we're told that the president will be speaking on videotape from a videotape made at Barksdale Air Force Base outside Shreveport, Louisiana. This is an unexplained situation, but understandably, the government doesn't want to explain everything they're doing and all the whereabouts of the president. The president was known to be in Florida earlier in the day. Then we got the report that he'd be speaking from Barksdale Air Force Base. Then we were told, well, he'd be speaking on videotape. To sort some of this out, our White House correspondent John Roberts is in Washington. John?
And was because, frankly, it just was not safe here, or even if it was safe, the Secret Service could not be assured of the president's safety. When I came into the White House this morning, the Secret Service at that point had not declared an alert, and within about 5 or 10 minutes of my arrival, suddenly they were evacuating the grounds, and then they decided to go beyond that and evacuate the building itself. After the twin attacks on the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York City, there had not been a national alert declared, but just about the time that I walked in the gate of the White House this morning, that other explosion occurred at the Pentagon, and that's when the Secret Service said, this is very serious. We're targeted here in Washington. We have to get everyone out. The Vice President and his staff, who were in the building at the time, were evacuated. They have been taken to an undisclosed location. We understand that the Vice President is with his wife, Lynn Cheney, as well. Louis Libby, his Chief of Staff, is with him, and Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor. They have established an off-campus situation room. There is a situation room, Dan, as you know, in the basement of the White House, in which the leaders of the National Security Council and the military meet anytime there is a potential for a national emergency, or anytime that there is a serious threat against American interests abroad. Because there is a plan here in Washington to devolve power from all of the agencies and departments to take them to remote locations. There is a situation room that is set up in a location other than the White House. That's where the Vice President, we understand, is working out of. We have not been told of that location, but we do understand that he is in charge of the national security aspect of this, along with Condoleezza Rice and his chief of staff. President Bush, I think, had intended to come back to Washington. He said in his statement this morning from Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, he said, unfortunately, I'll be going back to Washington immediately after my remarks. But obviously the Secret Service believed that it was not safe for him to come back to the White House, not safe for anyone, even at this point, to be within blocks of the White House. They have an immense cordon around that historic building, Dan. And one of the so-called doomsday aircraft, one of those 747s that had been dispatched to fly around the country as a command and control center in the event of nuclear war, in fact, had established a secure air corridor over Washington, and we saw a couple of F-16s flying over the area as well, just in case one of these aircraft may have been headed for the White House. I mean, they had to figure that if the Pentagon had been targeted, that one of those aircraft, not saying that it might be the one that went to Pittsburgh or not, but one of those aircraft could well have been targeted at the White House, and there just are not the defenses on hand at the White House, at least as I understand it, to knock something like a 757 out of the sky. So, Dan, this area is still not seen as safe. That's why the president is in Louisiana. We'll be hearing from him shortly from Barksdale Air Force Base. Dan?
And we're told, to repeat for emphasis, John Roberts, that the president will be on videotape from Barksdale Air Force Base. Certainly there will be those from the Hate America centers who will take some satisfaction in that the President of the United States cannot return to the White House immediately. On the other hand, the Secret Service and other agencies in matters such as this understandably want to be super safe, super cautious, and that's what they're doing under these circumstances. This is an unprecedented attack on American institutions, on the American people, on our own home ground, unprecedented. Never happened in this scale in the 20th century, never has happened in the 21st century. This scene from ground level in New York, the World Trade Center area, shows you what the conditions there are. And Russ Mitchell is here with more details about New York hospitals being overwhelmed with the casualties. Russ?
That is correct, Dan. New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani says right now the city is utilizing some 50 hospitals in the area, and that's expected to climb to 100 hospitals by the end of the day. He is also urging residents to leave Lower Manhattan, the area where the World Trade Center towers were. Strange to say that, but where they were. As you have said several times today, Dan, all of New York is about on fire, but downtown Manhattan is awful chaotic, and complicating this situation is all subway service in Manhattan has been suspended. Subways, the way many people, millions of New Yorkers get to work every day, that subway service has been suspended. Therefore, people are being urged to evacuate Lower Manhattan. Another concern that city officials have is many police officers and firefighters are believed to have been injured in the blast downtown this morning. And beyond New York, the U.S.-Mexico border has been closed, and the U.S.-Canada border has been closed as well.
Russ Mitchell. Authorities in Washington immediately after the Pentagon was hit began deploying troops, including an infantry regiment. This is a precaution. The Situation Room at the White House is in full operation. Vice President Dick Cheney in charge with Condoleezza Rice, head of the National Security Council, at his side with their aides. Authorities are on alert from coast to coast. Air traffic throughout the country has been halted, and there's been a significant tightening of security at strategic installations. American Airlines identified the planes that crashed into the Trade Center as Flight 11, a Los Angeles-bound jet hijacked after takeoff from Boston with 92 people aboard, and Flight 77, which was seized while carrying 64 people from Washington to Los Angeles. Just pause for a second. New information is coming in, and information is being concerned. American Airlines now says that 2 of their planes were crashed into the World Trade Center. First, Flight 11, Los Angeles-bound out of Boston, 92 people aboard. How did the hijackers get control of that plane? How did they crash it into the building? It has the signature marks of a suicide mission, of course. And then The other American Airlines flight, 64 people from Washington to Los Angeles crashed into the World Trade Center. Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana, news alert. President Bush says military on high alert status. Bush says he has taken all appropriate security precautions to protect Americans. There'll be more coming. This from the videotaped talk to the American people that President Bush
free in-home
of 2001 bombed, in the sense that American Airlines says 2 of its planes were hijacked, and then they were we know not how, the details of them, but they were crashed into the World Trade Center itself. These scenes are where the debris is thick and the smoke goes like clouds and will for a long while in lower Manhattan, on the edge of Greenwich Village, right at the tip of Manhattan, with the Statue of Liberty in the background. These attacks have occurred one day before the sentencing of an associate of Osama bin Laden in connection with the embassy bombings in Tanzania in 1998. The sentencing of this associate of bin Laden, and forgive my pronunciation, Mohammed al-Okali, the accused in that were convicted in a court here in Manhattan. They face the death penalty.
From WRAL News, this is a special report.
I'm David Crabtree as we continue our live coverage on WRAL News Channel on this day of great American tragedy, worldwide tragedy. We have asked several members of the faith community of the Triangle to come together to talk about the trauma of this, the need of prayer, and how people in their respective communities are responding. We're joined this afternoon by Bishop F. Joseph Gossman of the Catholic Diocese of Raleigh, Reverend Bob Sawyer, representing the Episcopal Diocese of North Carolina, Abdul Wahid, Muslim cleric, and Lucy Denner, who is the rabbi of Temple Bethor. Bishop Gossman, I'm here, so I'll start with you on this end. Obviously, everyone is shocked, traumatized. One question asked of me by a viewer earlier is, in the midst of this, where is God?
I think the best answer that I've heard so far today is that God is very sad because of this event, and that God is with us even in the tragedy, but God certainly looks at this world and has to be very, very sorry about what happened today.
Bob Sawyer, when you hear from people within your community of faith who say, we want to gather to pray, what do you pray for at a time like this?
I think we pray for a sense of God's peace in the lives of those who have lost members of their family. We lift up the lives of those who have died and entrust them to God's eternal care, but especially for those who are behind, for those who are trying to make contact with family members. We pray for a sense of peace and wholeness in their life. We pray that they might know God's loving compassion at this terrible time of grief. We also pray for our country at this time, that all who know and love freedom might continue to be able to reach out to those who are in need. But especially, we lift up in our community those who have lost loved ones.
Abdul Wahid, people are saying today, how can this happen? To those within your community, what responses have you heard on this sad day?
Well, first, that we express our condolences to the families who have lost loved ones, and also those who have been hurt. Certainly, it's a terrible act upon human life. We also express our concern for value and appreciation for human life. We have to pray God bless human beings to have more value and appreciation for the sacred life of human beings.
Lucy Denner, to those within the Jewish community that you've spoken with today and those others that you've spoken with outside the community, obviously the shock is, the response I'm sure is one of shock and sadness, but it goes much deeper than that for many people.
I think that all of us feel for the victims of this tragedy. Our hearts are there with them, with their families. In addition, there's a sense of a need of standing together with the leaders of our country, the leaders of our government, of doing all that we can in prayer and support to add strength so that we can face what is before us, that we can help those who are facing tragedy to find a sense of calm, to restore to them a sense of the beauty and the value in all life.
Where were you when you heard this morning?
I was in the car on the way taking my kids to school and heard about the first crash in the World Trade Center. It was unclear at that time. The report did seem to say that the plane crashed very directly, and it sounded like a terrorist attack, but it was unclear at that point. And then as I was in the car, it became more clear what was happening. That
no one has officially claimed responsibility for this yet, but there was already video coming in this afternoon from the West Bank. And granted, just a few people, but celebrations within some of the Palestinian community. As a Jew and an American, what does that do to you when you see or hear about that?
Well, as a Jew, as an American, it makes me profoundly sad. I don't see that as a commentary on the Palestinians' involvement in this. I think that that situation in the Middle East is a terrible situation right now, and the Palestinians as well as the Israelis are under terror and feel besieged. But the response to that kind of terror, that kind of response to this terror, is a profound sense of sadness for me.
Abdul Wahid, whether it's right or wrong, there will be outrage around the world until we know specifically who's behind this, but there's already fingers being pointed at some within the far extreme factions of the Muslim community. How do you prepare, how do you respond to that?
Well, we have, in this area and throughout the country, we have worked to establish real sound, solid relationships with other people of faith. So we have to continue that effort, and people who know us know what we represent.
And those who don't know you, when you say know what we represent, how do you sum that up?
They will know that as a Muslim community, Islam teaches us to have appreciation for human life, to have cooperation with other people of faith and all good human beings. I have a button here on, it's called Goodness is on the Rise. That's what we promote. And that goodness doesn't have to be goodness coming from Muslims, the Jews, Christians, any human being that does good, we promote that, we support that. And people will know by our life what we represent.
We are at a time, as we mentioned earlier, of trauma. Reality has not begun to sink in yet for a lot of people because we don't know the untold numbers of lives that have been lost. Bob, in the coming days, much less weeks, how do you begin to prepare those around you who will have questions and deep sadness that we don't yet know exactly how deep it's going to go?
One of the things I think that we can do as a faith community is to begin to talk among ourselves and to allow people to tell their story and how it has affected them, to be able to let them to know that this is still God's world, that God still looks down upon this world and His creation is good. I truly believe that those who took part in this attack, whether they said it had a religious meaning or whatever, are not adherents to any religion. None of our religions preach anything that would cause for the taking of human life to further one's own religious beliefs. I know, looking at my own experience this morning, I had just come out of morning prayer at the church, and when I came over to the office, the word had come out, and we turned on the TV sets in the office. and just the pictures, watching the towers fall, hit me in such a deeply profound way that I know that other people watching that probably felt the same way. And I think the one thing we can do, as I said earlier, is to continue to talk to each other in all of our faith communities about what it is that we are called to do and to be as people of faith, and to allow each person to tell their story of how this has affected them.
Bishop Gossman, there is no holy war. I mean, I would think that's an oxymoron. You have lived through wars and rumors of wars in this country. When you experience what you've seen today, on a personal level, what happened with you?
Well, David, I thought, first of all, the fact that I have lived through World War II and the Korean War, and war was always something that we saw in the movies and on newsreels. We never really had any personal experience in this continent of war, except that our men were called into service. I think that forever, our world, in the United States at least, will never be the same because of what happened today, no matter who did it or why they did it. And I think that what our job is, and it is a mighty task, is to help people realize that we are here as religious communities to try to make this world the world that God created it to be. And that's always been hard. But when an event like this takes place, I think we suddenly realize the tremendous, tremendous challenge that we face as religious believers. We have to somehow or other inspire people with hope in spite of what they have experienced and the tragedy and the pain that so many people are feeling, not only as a group of people in this country, but people who have lost members of their family and seen such terrible things. We really have a tremendous job to try to help the people understand and see this and still believe that God loves the world and God loves us and all the people in it.
There are houses of worship that are open throughout the Triangle and will continue to be open for prayer. Some may have not opened yet, but they will be later. There are special masses and different services that are going to be held. But before we close this out, I want to at least offer up to each of you here, if there are words of encouragement, either through or not specifically within a prayer, I would at least like to offer you the opportunity to offer that up. Lucy, we'll begin with you.
I turn to the voice of sacred text. God, what are we and what is your regard for us? We are our breath, our days, a passing shadow. Let us return, O God. Let us be wise and understand where we are going. For as we carry nothing with us, we can leave behind only those wholehearted tasks that build wholeness and peace. Amen.
Yes. With God's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, our Lord, pour out on us patience and constancy, make our steps firm, and help us against any that refuse to be right. Amen.
Lord, we lift up to you those who have died this day, that you might receive them within your loving embrace. We lift up to you their families, that you might touch them in this deep hour of grief. Lord, we pray for our country, that these acts might bring us closer together. Help us as a community of faith to witness to the goodness of your mercy, to offer hope to all who are in need. In your holy name we ask this. Amen.
And Bishop Gossman, we'll close with you.
Gracious and loving God, we know that you have not abandoned us. And yet, many people in our country today, those who have lost loved ones and those who haven't, wonder. Help us to retain the hope that comes from your loving care and guidance in our world. Help us to pull together, to rise to the occasion that this terrible tragedy has brought us to, and give us a true sense of hope that you are with us, that you are always with us no matter what, and that good can come out of this awful, awful event. We ask this as we ask all things through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Bishop Joseph Gossman, Reverend Bob Sawyer, Rabbi Lucy Denner, Imam Abdul Wahid, I thank you for taking your time to come in and to share your thoughts with this community. Healing is going to be a long time coming for this nation and this world, and we thank you. We'll be back with more a bit later.
For the victims and their families. The resolve of our great nation is being tested. But make no mistake, we will show the world that we will pass this test. God bless.
President Bush on videotape from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Where the president is at this moment, we do not know. The president said freedom itself was attacked by a faceless coward, and freedom will be defended.